Chapter 26 of The Borough Treasurer by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. Chapter 26 The Virtues of Suspicion. During that week Mallalieu was to learn by sad experience that it is a very poor thing to acquire information at second hand. There he was, a strictly guarded, if cosseted and pampered, prisoner, unable to put his nose outside the cottage, and entirely dependent on Chris Pett for any and all news of the world which lay so close at hand and was just then so deeply and importantly interesting to him. Time hung very heavily on his hands. There were books enough on the shelves of his prison parlour, but the late Kiteley's taste had been of a purely professional nature, and just then Mallalieu had no liking for murder cases, criminal trials, and that sort of gruesomeness. He was constantly asking for newspapers, and was skilfully put off. It was not within Christopher's scheme of things to let Mallalieu get any accurate notion of what was really going on. Miss Pett did not take in a newspaper. Christopher invariably forgot to bring one in when he went to the town. Twice, being pressed by Mallalieu to remember, he brought back the Times of the day before, wherein, of course, Mallalieu failed to find anything about himself. And it was about himself that he so wanted to hear, about how things were, how people talked of him, what the police said, what was happening generally, and his only source of information was Chris. Mr. Pett took good care to represent everything in his own fashion. He was assiduous in assuring Mallalieu that he was working in his interest with might and main, jealous in proclaiming his own and his aunt's intention to get him clear away to Norcaster. But he also never ceased dilating on the serious nature of the enterprise, never wearied in protesting how much risk he and Miss Pett were running, never refrained from showing the captive how very black things were, and how much blacker they would be if it were not for his present jailer's goodness. And when he returned to the cottage after the inquest on Stoner, his face was unusually long and grave as he prepared to tell Mallalieu the news. "Things are looking in a very bad way for you, Mr. Mallalieu," he whispered, when he was closeted with Mallalieu in the little room which the captive now hated fiercely and loathingly. "They look in a very bad way indeed, sir. If you were in any other hands than ours, Mr. Mallalieu, I don't know what you'd do. We are running the most fearful risks on your behalf. We are indeed. Things is dismal." Mallalieu's temper, never too good, and all the worse for his enforced confinement, blazed up. "Hang it! Why don't you speak out plain?" he snarled. "Say what you mean, and be done with it. What's up now, like? Things are no worse than they were, I reckon." Christopher slowly drew off one of the black kid gloves, and blew into it before laying it on the table. "No need to use strong language, Mr. Mallalieu," he said deprecatingly, as he calmly proceeded to divest the other hand. "No need at all, sir, between friends and gentlemen. Mr. Mallalieu, things are a lot worse. The coroner's jury has returned a verdict of wilful murder against you." Mallalieu's big face turned a queer, grey hue. That word murder was particularly distasteful to him. "Against me?" he muttered. "Why me particularly? There were two of us charged. What about Cotherstone?" "I'm talking about the inquest," said Christopher. "They don't charge anybody at inquests. They only inquire in general. The verdict's against you, and you only. And it was Cotherstone's evidence that did it." "Cotherstone!" exclaimed Mallalieu. "Evidence against me? He's a liar if—" "I'll tell you, all in due order," interrupted Chris. "Be calm, Mr. Mallalieu, and listen. Be judicial." But in spite of this exhortation Mallalieu fumed and fretted, and when Christopher had told him everything he looked as if it only required a little resolution on his part to force himself to action. "I've a good mind to go straight out of this place and straight down to the police," he growled. "I have indeed. A great mind to go and give myself up, and have things proved." "Do," said Christopher heartily. "I wish you would, sir. It'd save me and my poor aunt a world of trouble. Only, it's my duty as a duly qualified solicitor of the High Court to inform you that every step you take from this haven of refuge will be a step towards the gallows." Mallalieu shrank back in his chair and stared at Mr. Pett's sharp features. His own blanched once more. "You're sure of that?" he demanded hoarsely. "Certain," replied Christopher. "No doubt of it, sir. I know." "What's to be done, then?" asked the captive. Christopher assumed his best consultation and advice manner. "What," he said at last, "in my opinion, is the best thing, is to wait and see what happens when Cotherstone's brought up before the bench next Tuesday. You're safe enough until then, so long as you do what we tell you. Although all the country is being watched and searched, there's not a ghost of a notion that you're in Highmarket. So remain as content as you can, Mr. Mallalieu, and as soon as we learn what takes place next Tuesday, we'll see about that plan of ours." "Let's be knowing what it is," grumbled Mallalieu. "Not quite matured, sir, yet," said Christopher, as he rose and picked up the silk hat and the kid gloves. "But when it is, you'll say, you'll say it's a most excellent one." So Mallalieu had to wait until the next Tuesday came round. He did the waiting impatiently and restlessly. He ate, he drank, he slept as he had never slept in his life, but he knew that he was losing flesh from anxiety. It was with real concern that he glanced at Christopher when that worthy returned from the adjourned case on the Tuesday afternoon. His face fell when he saw that Christopher was gloomier than ever. "Worse and worse, Mr. Mallalieu," whispered Christopher mysteriously when he had shut the door. "Everything's against you, sir. It's all centering and fastening on you. What do you think happened? Cotherstone's discharged." "What!" exclaimed Mallalieu, jumping in his chair. "Discharged! Why, then, they'd have discharged me." Christopher laid his finger on the side of his nose. "Would they?" he said, with a knowing wink. "Not much they wouldn't. Cotherstone's let loose, to give evidence against you, when you're caught." Mallalieu's small eyes began to bulge and a dull red to show on his cheek. He looked as if he were bursting with words which he could not get out, and Christopher Pett hastened to improve the occasion. "It's my opinion it's all a plant," he said. "A conspiracy, if you like, between Cotherstone and the authorities. Cotherstone, he's got the smartest solicitor in Norcaster and the shrewdest advocate on this circuit. You know him, Mr. Mallalieu. Stilby's the solicitor and Gradston the barrister, and it strikes me it's a put-up job. Do you see through it? First of all, Cotherstone gives evidence at that inquest. On his evidence a verdict of murder is returned against you. Now Cotherstone's discharged by the magistrates, no further evidence being offered against him. Why? So he can give evidence before the magistrates and at the assizes against you, that is, when you're caught." "They've got to catch me yet," growled Mallalieu. "Now then, what about this plan of yours? For I'm going to wait no longer. Either you tell me what you're going to do for me, or I shall walk out of that door as soon as it's dark tonight, and take my chances. Do you hear that?" Christopher rose, opened the door, and softly called Miss Pett. And Miss Pett came, took a seat, folded her thin arms, and looked attentively at her learned nephew. "Yes, sir," said Christopher, resuming the conversation. "I hear that, and we are now ready to explain plans and discuss terms. You will, of course, recompense us, Mr. Mallalieu." "I've said all along that you'd not lose by me," retorted Mallalieu. "Aught in reason, I'll pay. But this plan of yours, I'm going to know what it is before we come to any question of paying. So out with it." "Well, it's an excellent plan," responded Christopher. "You say that you'll be safe if you're set down in a certain point at Norcaster, near the docks. Now that will suit our plans exactly. You're aware, of course, Mr. Mallalieu, that my aunt here is about to remove her goods and chattels, bequeathed by Mr. Kitely, deceased, from this house? Very well. The removal's to take place to morrow. I've already arranged with Mr. Strawson, furniture remover, to send us a couple of vans to morrow morning, very early. Into those vans the furniture will be placed, and the vans will convey it to Norcaster, whence they will be transshipped bodily to London by sea. Mr. Mallalieu, you'll leave here, sir, in one of those vans." Mallalieu listened, considered, began to see possibilities. "Aye," he said with a cunning glance. "Aye, that's not a bad notion. I can see my way in that respect. But how am I going to get into a van here, and got out of it there, without the vanmen knowing?" "I've thought it all out," answered Christopher. "You must keep snug in this room until afternoon. We'll get the first van off in the morning, say by noon. I'll so contrive that the second van won't be ready to start until after it's dusk. When it is ready the men'll go down to fetch their horses. I'll give 'em something to get themselves a drink before they come back. That'll delay 'em a bit longer. And while they're away, we'll slip you into the van, and I shall go with that van to Norcaster. And when we get to the shed at Norcaster, where the vans are to be left, the two men will go away with their horses, and I shall let you out. It's a good plan, Mr. Mallalieu." "It'll do, anyhow," agreed Mallalieu, who felt heartily relieved. "We'll try it, but you must take all possible care until I'm in and we're off. The least bit of a slip—" Mr. Pett dryly remarked that if any slips occurred they would not be of his making. After which both he and his aunt coughed several times and looked at the guest prisoner in a fashion which seemed to invite speech from him. "All right, then," said Mallalieu. "To-morrow, you say? All right. All right." Miss Pett coughed again and began to make pleats in her apron. "Of course, Christopher," she said, addressing her nephew as if there were no other person present, "of course, Mr. Mallalieu has not yet stated his terms." "Oh, ah, just so," replied Christopher, starting as from a pensive reverie. "Ah, to be sure. Now, what would you say, Mr. Mallalieu? How do you feel disposed, sir?" Mallalieu looked fixedly from aunt to nephew, from nephew to aunt. Then his face became hard and rigid. £50 apiece," he said. "That's how I'm disposed. And you don't get an offer like that every day, I know. £50 apiece." Miss Pett inclined her turbaned head towards her right shoulder and sighed heavily. Mr. Pett folded his hands, looked at the ceiling, and whistled. "We don't get an offer like that every day," he murmured. "No, I should think we didn't. £50 apiece. £100 altogether, for saving a fellow creature from the gallows. Oh, Mr. Mallalieu!" "Hang it! How much money do you think I'm likely to carry on me? Me, in my unfortunate position!" snarled Mallalieu. "Do you think—" "Christopher," observed Miss Pett, rising and making for the door, "I should suggest that Mr. Mallalieu is left to consider matters. Perhaps when he's reflected a bit—" She and her nephew went out, leaving Mallalieu fuming and grumbling. At once in the living room she turned to Christopher with a shake of the head. "What did I tell you?" she said. "Mean as a miser. My plan's much the best. We'll help ourselves, and then we can snap our fingers at him. I'll give him an extra strong nightcap to-night, and then—" But before the close of that evening came, Mallalieu's notions underwent a change. He spent the afternoon in thinking. He knew that he was in the power of two people who, if they could, would skin him. And the more he thought the more he began to be suspicious. And suddenly he wondered why he slept so heavily at night. And all of a sudden he saw the reason. Drugged. That old she-devil was drugging his drink. That was it, of course, but it had been for the last time. She shouldn't do it again. That night when Miss Pett brought the hot toddy, mixed according to the recipe of the late Kitely, Mallalieu took it at his door, saying he was arrayed for sleep, and would drink it when in bed. After which he carefully poured it into a flower pot that graced his room, and when he presently lay down, it was with his eyes and ears open, and his revolver ready to his right hand. End of Chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Borough Treasurer by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. Chapter 27. Mr. Raythwaite of Ray. Had the mayor of Highmarket, lying there sullen and suspicious, only known what was taking place close to him at that very moment, only known what had been happening in his immediate vicinity during the afternoon and evening, he might have taken some course of action which would have prevented what was shortly to come. But he knew nothing, except that he was angry, and full of doubts, and cursed everything and everybody that had led to this evil turn in his fortunes, and was especially full of vindictiveness towards the man and woman in the next room, who, as he felt sure, were trying to take advantage of his present helplessness. And meanwhile, not far away, things were going on, and they had been going on all that day since noon. Brereton, going away from Highmarket to Town Hall after the dramatic discharge of Cotherstone, was suddenly accosted by a smart-looking young man whom, at first glance, he knew to be in some way connected with the law. "Mr. Gifford Brereton?" inquired this stranger. "I have a note for you, sir." Brereton took the note and stepped aside into a quiet corner. The young man followed and stood near. To Brereton's surprise he found himself looking at a letter in the handwriting of a London solicitor who had 2 or 3 times favoured him with a brief. He hastily glanced through its contents. "The Duke's Head Hotel, Norcaster. Dear Mr. Brereton, I have just arrived at this place on business which is closely connected with that which you have in hand. I shall be much obliged if you would join me here at once, bringing with you the daughter of your client Harborough. It is important that she should accompany you. The bearer will have a car in readiness for you. Yours sincerely, H. C. Carfax." Brereton put the note in his pocket and turned to the messenger. "Mr. Carfax wishes me to return with you to Norcaster," he remarked. "He mentions a car." "Here, Mr. Brereton, round the corner, a good one that will run us up there in 20 minutes," replied the messenger. "There's a call to make first," said Brereton. He went round the corner with his companion and recognised in the chauffeur who waited there a man who had once or twice driven him from Norcaster of late. "Ah," he said, "I dare say you know where Miss Northrup lives in this town? Up near the foot of the shawl? You do? Run us up there, then. Are you one of Mr. Carfax's clerks?" he asked, when he and the messenger had got into the car. "Have you come down with him from London?" "No, sir. I'm a clerk at Willoughby and Hargreaves in Norcaster," replied the messenger. "Carfax and Spilington are our London agents. Mr. Carfax and some other gentlemen came down from town first thing this morning, and Mr. Carfax got me to bring you that note." "You don't know what he wants to see me about?" asked Brereton, who was already curious to the point of eagerness. "Well, sir, I have a pretty good idea," answered the clerk, with a smile. "But I think Mr. Carfax would rather tell you everything himself. We shall be there soon, Mr. Brereton, if the young lady doesn't keep us." Brereton ran into Northrup's house, and carried Avis off with scant ceremony. "This, of course, has something to do with your father's case," he said, as he led her down to the car. "It may be but no, we won't anticipate. Only, I'm certain things are going to right themselves. Now then," he called to the driver, as they joined the clerk, "get along to Norcaster as fast as you can." Within half an hour the car stopped at the old-fashioned gateway of the Duke's Head in Norcaster market-place, and the clerk immediately led his 2 companions into the hotel and upstairs to a private sitting-room, at the door of which he knocked. A voice bade him enter. He threw the door open, and announced the visitors. "Miss Harborough, Mr. Brereton, Mr. Carfax," he said. Brereton glanced sharply at the men who stood in the room, evidently expectant of his and his companion's arrival. Carfax, a short middle-aged man, quick and bustling in manner, he of course knew; the others were strangers. 2 of them Brereton instantly set down as detectives. There were all the marks and signs of the craft upon them. They stood in a window, whispering together, and at them Brereton gave but a glance. But at the 4th man, who stood on the hearth-rug, he looked long and hard, and his thoughts immediately turned to the night on which he and Avis had visited the old woman who lived in the lonely house on the moors, and to what she had said about a tall man who had met Harborough in her presence, a tall bearded man. For the man who stood there before him, looking at Avis with an interested, somewhat wistful smile, was a tall, bearded man, a man past middle age, who looked as if he had seen a good deal of the far-off places of the world. Carfax had hurried forward, shaken hands with Brereton, and turned to Avis while Brereton was making this rapid inspection. "So here you are, Brereton, and this young lady, I suppose, is Miss Harborough?" he said, drawing a chair forward. "Glad you've come. And I dare say, you're wondering why you've been sent for. Well, all in good time. But first, this gentleman is Mr. John Raithwaite." The big man started forward, shook hands hastily with Brereton, and turned more leisurely to Avis. "My dear young lady," he said, "I the fact is, I'm an old friend of your father's, and it will be very soon now that he's all right, and all that sort of thing, you know. You don't know me, of course." Avis looked up at the big bearded figure, and from it to Brereton. "No," she said, "but I think it was you who sent that money to Mr. Brereton." "Ah, you're anticipating, young lady," exclaimed Carfax. "Yes, we've a lot of talking to do, and we'd better all sit down and do it comfortably. One moment," he continued, and turned away to the two men in the window, who, after a few words with him, left the room. "Now then, we'll do our first part of the business, Brereton," he went on, as they all took seats at a table near the fire. "You, of course, don't know who this gentleman is?" "Not at all," replied Brereton. "Very good," continued Carfax, rubbing his hands as if in enjoyment of the situation. "Then you've some interesting facts to hear about him. To begin with, he's the man who, when your client, this young lady's father, is brought up at the coming assizes, will provide a complete alibi on his behalf. In other words, he's the man with whom Harborough was in company during the evening and the greater part of the night on which Kiteley was murdered." "I thought so," said Brereton. He looked reflectively at Mr. Raithwaite. "But why did you not come forward at once?" he asked. My advice!" exclaimed Carfax, hastily. "I'm going to explain the reasons. Now, you won't understand, Brereton, but Miss Harborough, I think, will know what I mean, or she'll have some idea, when I say that this gentleman is now, mind you, Mr. Raithwaite of Wray." Avis looked up quickly with evident comprehension, and the solicitor nodded. "You see, she knows," he went on, turning to Brereton. "At least, that conveys something to her. But it doesn't to you. Well, my dear sir, if you were a native of these parts it would. Wray is one of the oldest and most historic estates between here and the Tweed. Everybody knows Wray. And everybody knows too that there has been quite a romance about Wray for some time, since the last Raithwaite died, in fact. That Raithwaite was a confirmed old bachelor. He lived to a great age. He outlived all his brothers and sisters, of whom he'd had several. He left quite a tribe of nephews and nieces who were distributed all over the world. Needless to say, there was vast bother and trouble. Finally, one of the nephews made a strong claim to the estate, as being the eldest known heir, and he was until recently in good trim for establishing his claim, when my client here arrived on the scene. For he is the eldest nephew. He is the rightful heir, and I am thankful to say that, only within this last day or two, his claim has been definitely recognized and established, and all without litigation. Everything," continued Carfax, again rubbing his hands with great satisfaction, "everything is now all right. And Mr. Raithwaite of Wray will take his proper and rightful place amongst his own people." "I'm exceedingly glad to hear it," said Brereton, with a smile at the big man, who continued to watch Avis as if his thoughts were with her rather than with his solicitor's story. "But you'll understand that I'd like to know how all this affects my client." "Yes," said Mr. Raithwaite, hastily. "Tell Mr. Brereton, Carfax. Never mind me and my affairs. Get on to poor Harborough." "Your affair and Harborough's are inextricably mixed, my dear sir," retorted Carfax, good humouredly. "I'm coming to the mingling of them. Well," he continued, addressing himself again to Brereton, "this is how things are, or were. I must tell you that the eldest brother of the late Squire of Wray married John Harborough's aunt, secretly. They had not been married long before the husband emigrated. He went off to Australia, leaving his wife behind until he had established himself. There had been differences between him and his family, and he was straitened in means. In his absence our friend here was born, and at the same time, sad to say, His mother died. The child was brought up by Harborough's mother. Mr. Raithwaite and Harborough are foster brothers. It remained in the care of Harborough's mother, who kept the secret of the marriage, until it was 7 years old. Then, opportunity occurring, it was taken to its father in Australia. The father, Matthew Raithwaite, made a big fortune in Australia, sheep farming. He never married again, and the fortune, of course, came at his death to his only son, our friend. Now, he had been told of the secret marriage of his father, but, being possessed of an ample fortune himself, he concerned himself little about the rest of the old family. However, a year or so ago, happening to read in the newspapers about the death of the old squire, his uncle, and the difficulty of definitely deciding the real heirship, he came over to England. But he had no papers related to his father's marriage, and he did not know where it had taken place. At that time he had not consulted me. In fact, he had consulted no one. If he had consulted me, continued Carfax, with a knowing wink at Brereton, we should have put him right in a few hours. But he kept off lawyers, and he sought out the only man he could remember, his foster brother, Harborough, and by Harborough's advice they met secretly. Harborough did not know where that marriage had taken place. He had to make inquiries all over this district. He had to search registers. Now and then, my client not my client then, of course came to see Harborough. When he did so, he and Harborough met in quiet places. And on the night on which that man Kiteley was murdered, concluded the solicitor, Harborough was with my client from 9 o'clock until 4:30 in the morning, when he parted with him near Hexendale railway station. Mr. Raithwaite will swear that." "And fortunately we have some corroboration," observed Brereton, with a glance at Avis. "For whether Mr. Raithwaite knows it or not, his meeting with Harborough on the moors that particular night was witnessed." "Capital! Capital!" exclaimed Carfax. "By a credible and creditable witness?" "An older woman of exceptional character," answered Brereton, "except that she indulges herself in a little night poaching now and then." "Ah, well, we needn't tell that when she goes into the witness box," said Carfax. "But that's most satisfactory. My dear young lady," he added, turning to Avis, "your father will be released like 1 o'clock. And then, I think," he went on bustling round on the new Squire of Wray, "then, my dear, I think Mr. Raithwaite here—" "Leave that to me, Carfax," interrupted Mr. Raithwaite, with a nod at Avis. "I'll tell this young lady all about that myself. In the meantime—" "Ah, just so," responded Carfax. "In the meantime we have something not so interesting or pleasing, but extremely important, to tell Mr. Brereton. Brereton, how are things going? Has any fresh light been thrown on the Kiteley murder? Nothing really certain and definite, you say? Very well, my dear sir, then you will allow me to throw some light on it." So saying, Carfax rose from his chair, quitted the room, and within another minute returned, solemnly escorting the two detectives. CHAPTER 28 of The Borough Treasurer by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. Chapter 28 Pages from the Past. Before the solicitor and his companions could seat themselves at the table whereat the former's preliminary explanation had been made, Mr. Raithwaite got up and motioned Avis to follow his example. "Carfax," he said, "there's no need for me to listen to all that you've got to tell Mr. Brereton. I know it already, and I don't think it will particularly interest Miss Harborough at the moment. She'll hear plenty about it later on. She and I will leave you. Make your explanations and your arrangements, and we'll join you later on." He led the way to the door, beckoning Avis to accompany him. But Avis paused and turned to Brereton. "You feel sure that it's all right now about my father?" she said. "You feel certain? If you do—" "Yes, absolutely," answered Brereton, who knew what her question meant. "And we'll let him know." "He knows!" exclaimed Carfax. "That is, he knows that Mr. Raithwaite is here, and that everything's all right. Run away, my dear young lady, and be quite happy. Mr. Raithwaite will tell you everything you want to know. And now, my dear sir," he continued, as he shut the door on Raythwaite and Abbess and bustled back to the table. "There are things that you want to know, and that you are going to know, from me and from these two gentlemen, Mr. Staub and Mr. Lakin, both ex-Scotland Yard men, and now in business for themselves as private inquiry agents. Smart fellows, though I say it to their faces." "I gather from that you've been doing some private inquiry work, then," said Brereton. "In connection with what, now?" "Let us proceed in order," answered Carfax, taking a seat at the head of the table, and putting his fingers together in a judicial attitude. "I will open the case. When Raythwaite, a fine fellow, who, between ourselves, is going to do great things for Harborough and his daughter, when Raythwaite, I say, heard of what had happened down here, he was naturally much upset. His first instinct was to rush to Highmarket at once and tell everything. However, instead of doing that, he very wisely came to see me. Having heard all that he had to tell, I advised him, as it was absolutely certain that no harm could come to Harborough in the end, to let matters rest for the time being, until we had put the finishing touches to his own affair. He, however, insisted on sending you that money, which was done. Nothing else would satisfy him. But now arose a deeply interesting phase of the whole affair, which has been up to now kept secret between Raythwaite, myself, and Messrs. Staub and Lakin there. To it I now invite your attention." Mr. Carfax here pulled out a memorandum book from his pocket, and having fitted on his spectacles glanced at a page or two within it. "Now," he presently continued, "Raythwaite being naturally deeply interested in the Kitely case, he procured the local newspapers, Norcaster and Highmarket papers, you know, so that he could read all about it. There was in those papers a full report of the first proceedings before the magistrates, and Raythwaite was pretty much struck by your examination of the woman, Miss Pett. In fact, he was so much struck by your questions and her replies that he brought the papers to me, and we read them together. And, although we know well enough that we should eventually have no difficulty whatever in proving an alibi in Harborough's behalf, we decided that in his interest we would make a few guarded but strict inquiries into Miss Pett's antecedents." Brereton started. Miss Pett! Ah! He had had ideas respecting Miss Pett at the beginning of things, but other matters had cropped up, and affairs had moved and developed so rapidly that he had almost forgotten her. "That makes you think," continued Carfax, with a smile. "Just so. And what took place at that magistrates' sitting made Raythwaite and myself think. And, as I say, we employed Staub and Lakin, men of great experience, to just find out a little about Miss Pett. Of course, Miss Pett herself had given us something to go on. She had told you some particulars of her career. She had been a housekeeper to a Major Stillman at Kandahar Cottage, Woking. She had occupied posts at 2 London hotels. So, Staub went to Woking, and Lakin devoted himself to the London part of the business. And I think, Staub," concluded the solicitor, turning to one of the inquiry agents, "I think you'd better tell Mr. Brereton what you found out at Woking, and then Lakin can tell us what he brought to light elsewhere." Staub, a big, cheery-faced man, who looked like a highly respectable publican, turned to Brereton with a smile. "It was a very easy job, sir," he said. "I found out all about the lady and her connection with Woking in a very few hours. There are plenty of folk at Woking who remember Miss Pett. She gave you the mere facts of her residence there correctly enough. But, naturally, she didn't tell you more than the mere facts, the surface, as it were. Now, I got at everything. Miss Pett was a housekeeper at Woking to a Major Stillman, a retired officer of an infantry regiment. At the time she was with him, some considerable period, he was more or less of an invalid, and he was well known to suffer terribly from some form of neuralgia. He got drugs to alleviate the pain of that neuralgia from every chemist in the place, one time or another, and one day Major Stillman was found dead in bed, with some of these drugs by his bedside. Of course an inquest was held, and, equally of course, the evidence of doctors and chemists being what it was, a verdict of death from misadventure, overdose of the stuff, you know, was returned. Against Miss Pett there appears to have been no suspicion in Woking at that time, and for the matter of that," concluded Staub dryly, I don't know that there is now." "You have some yourself?" suggested Brereton. "I went into things further," answered Mr. Stobb, with the ghost of a wink. "I found out how things were left, by Stillman. Stillman had nothing but his pension, and a capital sum of about £2,000. He left that £2,000, and the furniture of his house, to Miss Pett. The will had been executed about a twelvemonth before Stillman died. It was proved as quickly as could be after his death, and of course Miss Pett got her legacy. She sold the furniture, and left the neighbourhood." "What is your theory?" asked Brereton. Mr. Stobb nodded across the table at Carfax. "Not my business to say what my theories are, Mr. Brereton," he answered. "All I had to do was to find out facts, and report them to Mr. Carfax and Mr. Raythwaite." "All the same," said Brereton quietly, "you think it quite possible that Miss Pett, knowing that Stillman took those strong doses, and having a pecuniary motive, gave him a still stronger one? Come now." Stobb smiled, rubbed his chin and looked at Carfax, and Carfax pointed to Stobb's partner, a very quiet, observant man who had listened with a sly expression on his face. "Your turn, Lacon," he said. "Tell the result of your inquiries." Lacon was one of those men who possess soft voices and slow speech. Invited to play his part, he looked at Brereton as if he were half apologizing for anything he had to say. "Well," he said, "of course, sir, what Miss Pett told you about her posts at 2 London hotels was quite right. She had been storekeeper at one, and linen keeper at another, before she went to Major Stillman. There was nothing against her at either of those places. But of course I wanted to know more about her than that. Now she said in answer to you that before she went to the first of these hotels she had lived at home with her father, a Sussex farmer. So she said, but it was a long time before. She had spent 10 years in India, between leaving home and going to the Royal Belvedere. She went out to India as a nurse in an officer's family, and while she was in India she was charged with strangling a fellow servant, a Eurasian girl who had excited her jealousy." Brereton started at that, and he turned a sharp glance on Carfax, who nodded emphatically and signed to Leighton to proceed. "I have the report of that affair in my pocket," continued Leighton, more softly and slowly than ever. "It's worth reading, Mr. Brereton, and perhaps you'll amuse yourself with it some time. But I can give you the gist of it in a few words. Pet was evidently in love with her master's orderly. He wasn't in love with her. She became madly jealous of this Eurasian girl, who was under nurse. The Eurasian girl was found near the house one night with a cord tightly twisted round her neck, dead, of course. There were no other signs of violence, but some gold ornaments which the girl wore had disappeared. Pet was tried, and she was discharged, for she set up an alibi, of a sort that wouldn't have satisfied me," remarked Lacon in an aside. "But there was a queer bit of evidence given which you may think of use now. One of the witnesses said that Pet had been much interested in reading some book about the methods of the thugs, and had talked in the servants' quarters of how they strangled their victims with shawls of the finest silk. Now this Eurasian girl had been strangled with a silk handkerchief, and if that handkerchief could only have been traced to Pet, she'd have been found guilty. But, as I said, she was found not guilty, and she left her place at once, and evidently returned to England. That's all, sir." "Stobb has a matter that might be mentioned," said Carfax, glancing at the other inquiry agent. "Well, it's not much, Mr. Brereton," said Stobb. "It's merely that we've ascertained that Kiteley had left all that he had to this woman, and that—" "I know that," interrupted Brereton. "She's made no concealment of it. Or rather, her nephew, acting for her, didn't." "Just so," remarked Stobb dryly. "But did you know that the nephew had already proved the will, and sold the property? No? Well, he has. Not much time lost, you see, after the old man's death, sir. In fact, it's been done about as quickly as it well could be done. and of course Miss Pett will have received her legacy, which means that by this time she'll have got all that Kiteley had to leave." Brereton turned to the solicitor, who during the recital of facts by the two inquiry agents had maintained his judicial attitude, as if he were on the bench and listening to the opening statements of counsel. "Are you suggesting, all of you, that you think Miss Pett murdered Kiteley?" he asked. "I should like a direct answer to that question." "My dear sir!" exclaimed Carfax, "what does it look like? You've heard the woman's record. The probability is that she did murder that Eurasian girl, that she took advantage of Stillman's use of drugs to finish him off. She's certainly benefited by Stillman's death, and she's without doubt benefited by Kiteley's. I repeat, what does it look like?" "What do you propose to do?" asked Brereton. The inquiry agents glanced at each other, and then at Carfax. And Carfax slowly took off his spectacles with a flourish, and looked more judicial than ever as he answered the young barrister's question. "I will tell you what I propose to do," he replied. "I propose to take these two men over to Highmarket this evening, and let them tell the Highmarket police all that they have just told you." End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Borough Treasurer by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. Chapter 29. Without Thought of Consequence. Everything was very quiet in the house where Mallalieu lay wide awake and watchful. It seemed to him that he had never known it so quiet before. It was quiet at all times, both day and night, for Miss Pett had a habit of going about like a cat, and Christopher was decidedly of the soft-footed order, and stepped from one room to another as if he were perpetually afraid of waking somebody, or trusting his own weight on his own toes. But on this particular night the silence seemed to be unusual, and it was all the deeper because no sound, not even the faint sighing of the wind in the firs and pines outside, came to break it. And Mallalieu's nerves, which had gradually become sharpened and irritated by his recent adventures and his close confinement, became still more irritable, still more set on edge, and it was with difficulty that he forced himself to lie still and to listen. Moreover, he was feeling the want of the stuff which had soothed him into such sound slumber every night since he had been taken charge of by Miss Pett, and he knew very well that though he had flung it away his whole system was crying out for the lack of it. What were those two devils after, he wondered, as he lay there in the darkness? No good, that was certain. Now that he came to reflect upon it, their conduct during the afternoon and evening had not been of a reassuring sort. Christopher had kept entirely away from him. He had not seen Christopher at all since the discussion of the afternoon, which Miss Pett had terminated so abruptly. He had seen Miss Pett twice or thrice. Miss Pett's attitude on each occasion had been that of injured innocence. She had brought him his tea in silence, his supper with no more than a word. It was a nice supper. She set it before him with an expression which seemed to say, that however badly she herself was treated, she would do her duty by others. And Mallalieu, seeing that expression, had not been able to refrain from one of his sneering remarks. "Think yourself very badly done to, don't you, missus?" he had exclaimed with a laugh. "Think I'm a mean un, what?" "I express no opinion, Mr. Mallalieu," replied Miss Pett, frigidly and patiently. "I think it better for people to reflect. A night's reflection," she continued, as she made for the door, "oft brings wisdom, even to them as doesn't usually cultivate it." Mallalieu had no objection to the cultivation of wisdom, for his own benefit, and he was striving to produce something from the process as he lay there, waiting. But he said to himself that it was easy enough to be wise after the event, and for him the event had happened. He was in the power of these two, whom he had long since recognized as an unscrupulous woman and a shifty man. They had nothing to do but hand him over to the police if they liked. For anything he knew, Christopher Pett might already have played false and told the police of affairs at the cottage. And yet on deeper reflection he did not think that possible, for it was evident that aunt and nephew were after all they could get, and they would get nothing from the police authorities, while they might get a good deal from him. But what did they expect to get from him? He had been a little perplexed by their attitude when he asked them if they expected him to carry a lot of money on him, a fugitive. Was it possible, the thought came to him like a thunderclap in the darkness, that they knew, or had some idea, of what he really had on him? That Miss Pett had drugged him every night he now felt sure. Well, then, in that case, how did he know that she hadn't entered his room and searched his belongings, and especially the precious waistcoat? Mallalieu had deposited that waistcoat in the same place every night, on a chair which stood at the head of his bed. He had laid it folded on the chair, had deposited his other garments in layers upon it, had set his candlestick and a box of matches on top of all, and everything had been there, just as he had placed things every morning when he opened his eyes. But he had come to know Miss Pett's stealthiness by that time, and he put out a hand now and fingered the pile of garments which lay, neatly folded, within a few inches of his head. It was all right, then, of course, and he drew his hand back to the revolver, separated from his cheek by no more than the thickness of the pillow. The touch of that revolver made him begin speculating afresh. If Miss Pett or Christopher had meddled with the waistcoat, the revolver, too, might have been meddled with. Since he had entered the cottage, he had never examined either waistcoat or revolver. Supposing the cartridges had been drawn? Supposing he was defenceless, if a pinch came? He began to sweat with fear at the mere thought, and in the darkness he fumbled with the revolver in an effort to discover whether it was still loaded. And just then came a sound, and Mallalieu grew chill with suspense. It was a very small sound, so small that it might have been no more than that caused by the scratch of the tiniest mouse in the wainscot. But in that intense silence it was easily heard, and with it came the faint glimmering of light. The light widened. There was a little further sound, and Mallalieu, peeping at things through his eyelashes, became aware that the door was open, that a tall, spare figure was outlined between the bed and the light without, and in that light, outside the door, well behind the thin form of Miss Pett, he saw Christopher Pett's sharp face and the glint of his beady eyes. Mallalieu was sharp enough of thought, and big man though he was, he had always been quick of action. He knew what Miss Pett's objective was, and he let her advance halfway across the room on her stealthy path to the waistcoat. But silently as she came on with that cat-like tread, Mallalieu had just as silently drawn the revolver from beneath his pillow and turned its small muzzle on her. It had a highly polished barrel, that revolver, and Miss Pett suddenly caught a tiny scintillation of light on it, and she screamed. And as she screamed Mallalieu fired, and the scream died down to a queer choking sound, and he fired again, and where Christopher Pett's face had shown itself a second before there was nothing, save another choking sound, and a fall in the entry where Christopher had stood and watched. After that followed a silence so deep that Mallalieu felt the drums of his ears aching intensely in the effort to catch any sound, however small, but he heard nothing, not even a sigh. It was as if all the awful silences that had ever been in the cavernous places of the world had been crystallized into one terrible silence and put into that room. He reached out at last and found his candle and the matches, and he got more light and leaned forward in the bed, looking. "Can't I got 'em both?" he muttered. "Both? But—" He slowly lifted himself out of bed, huddled on some of the garments that lay carefully folded on the chair, and then, holding the candle to the floor, went forward where the woman lay. She had collapsed between the foot of the bed and the wall. Her shoulders were propped against the wall, and the grotesque turban hung loosely down on one shoulder. And Mallalieu knew in that quick glance that she was dead, and he crept onward to the door and looked at the other still figure, lying just as supinely in the passage that led to the living room. He looked longer at that, and suddenly he turned back to his parlour bedchamber, and carefully avoiding the dead woman, put on his boots and began to dress with feverish haste. And while he hurried on his clothes, Mallalieu thought. He was not sure that he had meant to kill these two. He would have delighted in killing them certainly, hating them as he did, but he had an idea that when he fired he only meant to frighten them. But that was neither here nor there now. They were dead, but he was alive, and he must get out of that, and at once. The moors, the hills, anywhere. A sudden heavy knocking at the door at the back of the cottage set Mallalieu shaking. He started for the front, to hear knocking there too. Then came voices demanding admittance, and loudly crying the dead woman's name. He crept to a front window at that, and carefully drew a corner of the blind and looked out, and saw many men in the garden. One of them had a lantern, and as its glare glanced about, Mallalieu set eyes on Cotherstone. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of The Borough Treasurer by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. Chapter 30 Cotherstone. Cotherstone walked out of the dock and the court and the town hall amidst a dead silence, which was felt and noticed by everybody but himself. At that moment he was too elated, too self-satisfied to notice anything. He held his head very high as he went out by the crowded doorway, and through the crowd which had gathered on the stairs. He might have been some general returning to be publicly fêted as he emerged upon the broad steps under the town hall portico and threw a triumphant glance at the folk who had gathered there to hear the latest news. And there, in the open air, and with all those staring eyes upon him, he unconsciously indulged in a characteristic action. He had caused his best clothes to be sent to him at Norcaster Jail the previous night, and he had appeared in them in the dock. The uppermost garment was an expensive overcoat, finished off with a deep fur collar. Now, as he stood there on the top step, facing the crowd, he unbuttoned the coat, threw its lapels aside, and took a long, deep breath, as if he were inhaling the free air of liberty. There were one or two shrewd and observant folk amongst the onlookers. It seemed to them that this unconscious action typified that Cotherstone felt himself throwing off the shackles which he had worn, metaphorically speaking, for the last 8 days. But in all that crowd no one went near Cotherstone. There were many of his fellow members of the corporation in it, councillors, aldermen, but none of them approached him or even nodded to him. All they did was to stare. The news of what had happened had quickly leaked out. It was known before he came into view that Cotherstone had been discharged. His appearance in that bold, self-assured fashion only led to covert whispers and furtive looks. But suddenly, from somewhere in the crowd, a sneering voice flung a contemptuous taunt across the staring faces. "Well done, Cotherstone! Saved your own neck, anyway!" There was a ripple of jeering laughter at that, and as Cotherstone turned angrily in the direction from whence the voice came, another, equally contemptuous, lifted itself from another corner of the crowd. "King's evidence! Yah! Who'd believe Cotherstone? Liar!" Cotherstone's face flushed angrily. The flush died as quickly away, and gave place to a sickly pallor. And at that a man who had stood near him beneath the portico, watching him inquisitively, stepped nearer and whispered, "Go home, Mr. Cotherstone. Take my advice, and get away quickly, at once." Cotherstone rejected this offer of good counsel with a sudden spasm of furious anger. "You be hanged!" he snarled. "Who's asking you for your tongue? D'ye think I'm afraid of a pack like yon? Who's going to interfere with me, I'd like to know? Go home yourself." He turned towards the door from which he had just emerged, turned to see his solicitor and his counsel coming out together, and his sudden anger died down, and his face relaxed to a smile of triumph. "Now then," he exclaimed, "didn't I tell you how it would be, a week since? Come on across to the Arms, and I'll stand a bottle, aye, 2 or 3 if you like, of the very best. Come on, both of you." The solicitor, glancing around, saw something of the state of affairs, hurriedly excused himself, and slipped back into the town hall by another entrance. But the barrister, a man who, great as his forensic abilities were, was one of those people who have no private reputation to lose, and of whom it was well known that he could never withstand the temptation to a bottle of champagne, assented readily, and with great good humour. And he and Cotherstone, arm in arm, walked down the steps and across the market place, and behind them the crowd sneered and laughed and indulged in audible remarks. Cotherstone paid, or affected to pay, no heed. He steered his companion into the Arms, and turned into the great bow-windowed room which served as morning meeting place for all the better class of loungers and townsmen in Highmarket. The room was full already. Men had come across from the court, and from the crowd outside. A babel of talk arose from every corner. But when Cotherstone and the well-known barrister, so famous in that circuit for his advocacy of criminals that he had acquired the nickname of Felon's Friend, entered, a dead silence fell, and men looked at this curious pair and then at each other with significant glances. In that silence, Cotherstone, seizing a waiter, loudly demanded champagne and cigars. He glared defiantly around him as he supplemented the order with a command for the best box of cigars in the house, the best champagne in the cellars. A loud laugh from some corner of the room broke the silence, and the waiter, a shrewd fellow who saw how things were, gave Cotherstone a look. "Come into the small parlour, Mr. Cotherstone," he whispered. "Nobody in there. You'll be more comfortable, sir." "All right, then," responded Cotherstone. He glared once more at the company around him, and his defiance suddenly broke out in another fashion. "Any friend of mine that likes to join us," he said pointedly, "is welcome. Who's coming, like?" There was another hoarse laugh at this, and most of the men there turned their backs on Cotherstone and began to talk loudly. But one or two of the less particular and baser sort, whom Cotherstone would certainly not have called friends a week before, nudged each other and made towards the door which the waiter held invitingly open. It was not every day that the best champagne and the best cigars were to be had for nothing, and if Cotherstone liked to fling his money about him, what did it matter, so long as they benefited by his folly? "That's the style," said Cotherstone, pushing the barrister along. "Bring 3 bottles," he cried to the waiter. "Big 'uns, and the best." An elderly man, one of Cotherstone's fellow members of the corporation, came forward and caught him by the arm. "Cotherstone," he whispered, "don't be a fool. Think of what's just over. Go home like a good fellow. Go quietly home. You're doing no good with this. You'll have all the town talking." "Hang the town, and you too!" snapped Cotherstone. "You're one of them that shouted at me in front of the town hall. Curse you! I'll let you and all Highmarket see what I care for you. What's it to you if I have a quiet glass of wine with my friends?" But there was no quiet drinking of a glass of wine in the parlour to which Cotherstone and his cronies retired. Whenever its door opened Cotherstone's excited tones were heard in the big room, and the more sober-minded of the men who listened began to shake their heads. "What's the matter with him?" asked one. "Nobody ever knew him like this before. What's he carrying on in that fashion for?" "He's excited with getting off," said another, "and that bit of a scene outside there threw him off his balance. He should have been taken straight home. Nice lot he's got with him, too. We all know what yon barrister chap is. He can drink champagne like water, they say. And for the others, listen to that now," he added, as a burst of excited talking came through the opened door. "He'll be in a fine fit state to go home to that daughter of his, I know, if that goes on." "It mustn't go on," said another, and got up. "I'll go across to Bent's, and get him to come over and take Cotherstone away. Bent's the only man that'll have any influence with him." He went out and crossed the market place to Bent's office, but Bent was not there. By his advice Letty had gone to stay with some friends until the recent proceedings were over in one way or another, and Bent himself, as soon as Cotherstone had left the court, had hurried away to catch a train to the town in which she was temporarily staying, in order to tell her the news and bring her home. So the would-be doer of good went back disappointed, and as he reached the hotel, Cotherstone and the barrister emerged from it, parted at the door with evident great cordiality, and went their several ways. And Cotherstone, passing the man who had been to Bent's, stared him in the face and cut him dead. "It's going to be war to the knife between Cotherstone and the town," remarked the ambassador, when he re-entered the big room and joined his own circle. "He passed me just now as if I were one of the paving stones he trod on. And did you see his face as he went out? Egad, instead of looking as if he'd had too much to drink, he looked too sober to please me. You mind if something doesn't happen. Yon fellow's desperate." "What should he be desperate about?" asked one of the group. "He saved his own neck." "It was that shouting at him when he came out that did it," observed another man quietly. "He's the sort of man to resent aught like that. If Cotherstone thinks public opinion's against him, well, we shall see." Cotherstone walked steadily away through the market place when he left the barrister. Whatever the men in the big room might have thought, he had not been indulging too freely in the little parlour. He had pressed champagne on the group around him, but the amount he had taken himself had not been great, and it had pulled him together instead of intoxicating him. And his excitement had suddenly died down, and he had stopped what might have developed into a drinking bout by saying that he must go home. At once outside, he made for his house, and as he went he looked neither to right nor left, and if he met friend or acquaintance his face became hard as flint. Cotherstone, indeed, was burning and seething with indignation. The taunts flung at him as he stood on the town hall steps, the looks turned in his direction as he walked away with the convivially inclined barrister, the expression on the faces of the men in the big room at the Highmarket Arms, all these things had stung him to the quick. He knew, whatever else he might have been, or was, he had proved a faithful servant to the town. He had been a zealous member of the corporation. He had taken hold of the financial affairs of the borough when they were in a bad way, and had put them in a safe and prosperous footing. He had worked, thought, and planned for the benefit of the place, and this was his reward. For he knew that those taunts, those looks, those half averted, half sneering faces meant one thing, and one thing only. The Haymarket men believed him equally guilty with Mallalieu, and had come to the conclusion that he was only let off in order that direct evidence against Mallalieu might be forthcoming. He cursed them deeply and bitterly, and sneered at them in the same breath, knowing that even as they were weathercocks, veering this way and that at the least breath of public opinion, so they were also utter fools, wholly unable to see or to conjecture. The excitement that had seized upon Cotherstone in face of that public taunting of him died away in the silence of his own house. When Letty and Bent returned home in the course of the afternoon, they found him unusually cool and collected. Bent had come with uneasy feelings and apprehensions. One of the men who had been at the Haymarket Arms had chanced to be in the station when he and Letty arrived, and had drawn him aside and told him of what had occurred, and that Cotherstone was evidently going on the drink. But there were no signs of anything unusual about Cotherstone when Bent found him. He said little about the events of the morning either to Bent or Letty. He merely remarked that things had turned out just as he had expected, and that now perhaps they would get matters settled. He had tea with them. He was busy with his books and papers in his own room until supper time. He showed no signs of anything unusual at supper, and when an hour later he left the house, saying that he must go down to the office and fetch the accumulated correspondence, his manner was so ordinary that Bent saw no reason why he should accompany him. But Cotherstone had no intention of going to his office. He left his house with a fixed determination. He would know once and for all what Haymarket felt towards and about him. He was not the man to live under suspicion and averted looks, and if he was to be treated as a suspect and a pariah he would know at once. There was at that time in Haymarket a small and select club, having its house in the market place, to which all the principal townsmen belonged. Both Mallalieu and Cotherstone had been members since its foundation. Cotherstone, indeed, was its treasurer. He knew that the club would be crowded that night. Very well. He would go there and boldly face public opinion. If his fellow members cut him, gave him the cold shoulder, ignored him, all right. He would know what to do then. But Cotherstone never got inside the club. As he set his foot on the threshold he met one of the oldest members, an alderman of the borough, for whom he had a great respect. This man, at sight of him, started, stopped, laid a friendly but firm hand on his arm, and deliberately turned him round. "No, my lad," he said kindly, "not in there to night. If you don't know how to take care of yourself, let a friend take care of you. Have a bit of sense, Cotherstone. Do you want to expose yourself again to what you got outside the town hall this noon? No, no. Go away, my lad. Go home. Come home with me, if you like. You're welcome." This last word softened Cotherstone. He allowed himself to be led away along the street. "I'm obliged to you," he said brusquely. You mean well. But do you mean to say that those fellows in there, men that know me, are thinking that?" "It's a hard, censorious world, this," answered the elder man. "Leave 'em alone a bit. Don't shove yourself on 'em. Come away. Come home and have a cigar with me." "Thank you," said Cotherstone. "You wouldn't ask me to do that if you thought as they do. Thank you. But I've something to do, and I'll go and do it at once." He pressed his companion's arm, and turned away, and the other man, watching him closely, saw him walk off to the police station, to the superintendent's private door. He saw him enter, and at that he shook his head and went away himself, wondering what it was that Cotherstone wanted with the police. The superintendent, tired by a long day's work, was taking his ease with his pipe and his glass when Cotherstone was shown into his parlour. He started with amazement at the sight of his visitor. Cotherstone motioned him back to his chair. "Don't let me disturb you," said Cotherstone. "I want a word or two with you in private, that's all." The superintendent had heard of the scene at the hotel, and had had his fears about its sequel, but he was quick to see that his visitor was not only sober, but remarkably cool and normal, and he hastened to offer him a glass of whisky. "Aye, thank you, I will," replied Cotherstone, seating himself. "It'll be the first spirits I've tasted since you locked me up, and I dare say it'll do me no harm. Now then," he went on, as the two settled themselves by the hearth, "I want a bit of straight talk with you. You know me. We've been friends. I want you to tell me, straight, plain, truthful, what are Highmarket folk thinking and saying about me? Come." The superintendent's face clouded, and he shook his head. "Well, you know what folks will be, Mr. Cotherstone," he answered, "and you know how very ready to say nasty things these Highmarket people are. I'm not a Highmarket man myself, any more than you are, and I've always regarded 'em as very bitter tongued folk, and so" "Out with it," said Cotherstone. "Let's know the truth. Never mind what tongues it comes from. What are they saying?" "Well," replied the superintendent, reluctantly, "of course I get to hear everything. If you must have it, the prevailing notion is that both you and Mr. Mallalieu had a hand in Kitely's death. They think his murder is at your doors, and that what happened to Stoner was by chance. And if you want the whole truth, they think you're a deal cleverer than Mallalieu, and that Kitely probably met his end at your hands, with your partner's connivance. And there are those who say that if Mallalieu's caught, as he will be, he'll split on you. That's all, sir." "And what do you think?" demanded Cotherstone. The superintendent shifted uneasily in his chair. "I've never been able to bring myself to think that either you or Mallalieu would murder a man in cold blood, as Kitely was murdered," he said. "As regards Stoner, I've firmly held to it that Mallalieu struck him in a passion, but I've always felt this you, or Mallalieu, or both of you, know more about that Kitely affair than you've ever told." Cotherstone leaned forward and tapped his host on the arm. "I do," he said significantly. "You're right in that. I do." The superintendent laid down his pipe and looked at his visitor gravely. "Then for goodness' sake, Mr. Cotherstone," he exclaimed, "for goodness' sake, tell! For as sure as we're sitting here, as things are at present, Mallalieu'll hang if you don't. If he doesn't hang for Stoner, he will for Kitely, for if he gets off over Stoner he'll be rearrested on the other charge." "Half an hour ago," remarked Cotherstone, "I shouldn't have minded if Mallalieu had been hanged half a dozen times. Revenge is sweet, and I've good reason for being revenged on Mallalieu. But now, I'm inclined to tell the truth. Do you know why? Why, to show these Highmarket folks that they're wrong." The superintendent sighed. He was a plain, honest, simple man, and Cotherstone's reason seemed a strange, even a wicked one, to him. To tell the truth merely to spite one's neighbour, a poor, poor reason, when there was a life at stake. "Aye, Mr. Cotherstone, but you ought to tell the truth in any case," he said. "If you know it, get it out and be done with it. We've had enough trouble already. If you can clear things up—" "Listen," interrupted Cotherstone. "I'll tell you all I know, privately. If you think good it can be put into proper form. Very well, then. You remember the night of Kitely's murder?" "Ay, I should think so," said the superintendent. "Good reason too." "Let your mind go back to it, and to what you've since heard of it," said Cotherstone. "You know that on that afternoon Kitely had threatened me and Mallalieu with exposure about the Wilchester affair. He wanted to blackmail us. I told Mallalieu, of course, we were both to think about it until the next day. But I did not but think. I didn't want exposure for my daughter's sake. I'd ha' given anything to avoid it, naturally. I had young Bent and that friend of his, Brereton, to supper that night. I was so full of thought that I went out and left 'em for an hour or more. The truth was I wanted to get a word with Kitely. I went up to the wood at the side of my house, towards Kitely's cottage, and all of a sudden I came across a man lying on the ground. Him, just where we found him afterwards." "Dead?" asked the superintendent. "Only just," replied Cotherstone. "But he was dead, and I saw what had caused his death, for I struck a match to look at him. I saw that empty pocket book lying by. I saw a scrap of folded newspaper, too, and I picked it up, and later, when I'd read it, I put it in a safe place. I've taken it from that place to night for the first time, and it's here. You keep it. Well, I went on, up to the cottage. The door was open, and I looked in. Yon woman, Miss Pett, was at the table by the lamp, turning over some papers. I saw Kitely's writing on some of 'em. I stepped softly in and tapped her on the arm, and she screamed and started back. I looked at her. 'Do you know that your master's lying dead, murdered, down amongst those trees?' I said. Then she pulled herself together, and she sort of got between me and the door. 'No, I don't,' she says, 'but if he is I'm not surprised, for I've warned him many a time about going out after nightfall.' I looked hard at her. 'What are you doing with his papers there?' I says. 'Papers?' she says. 'They're naught but old bills, and things that he gave me to sort.' 'That's a lie,' I says. 'Those aren't bills, and I believe you know something about this, and I'm off for the police, to tell.' Then she pushed the door to behind her and folded her arms and looked at me. 'You tell a word,' she says, 'and I'll tell it all over the town that you and your partner's a couple of ex-convicts. I know your tale. Kitely'd no secrets from me. You stir a step to tell anybody, and I'll begin by going straight to young Bent, and I'll not stop at that, neither.' So you see where I was. I was frightened to death of that old affair getting out, and I knew that Kitely was a liar, and had told this old woman all about it, and well, I hesitated. And she saw that she had me, and she went on. 'You hold your tongue, and I'll hold mine,' she says. 'Nobody'll accuse me, I know. But if you speak one word, I'll denounce you. You and your partner are much more likely to have killed Kitely than I am.' Well, I still stood, hesitating. 'What's to be done?' I asked at last. 'Do naught,' she said. 'Go home, like a wise man, and know nothing about it. Let him be found, and say naught. But if you do, you know what to expect.' 'Not a word that I came in here, then?' I said at last. 'Nobody'll get no words from me beyond what I choose to give 'em,' she says. 'And silence about the other?' I said. 'Just as long as you're silent,' she says. And with that I walked out, and I set off towards home by another way. And just as I was leaving the wood to turn into the path that leads into our lane, I heard a man coming along, and I shrank into some shrubs and watched for him till he came close up. He passed me and went on to the cottage, and I slipped back then and looked in through the window, and there he was, and they were both whispering together at the table, and it was this woman's nephew, Pett, the lawyer." The superintendent, whose face had assumed various expressions during this narrative, lifted his hands in amazement. But we were in and about that cottage most of that night, afterwards," he exclaimed. "We never saw aught of him. I know he was supposed to come down from London the next night, but" "Tell you he was there that night," insisted Cotherstone. "Do you think I could mistake him? Well, I went home, and you know what happened afterwards. You know what she said and how she behaved when we went up, and of course I played my part. But That bit of newspaper I've given you. I read it carefully that night, last thing. It's a column cut out of a walking newspaper of some years ago. It's to do with an inquest in which this woman was concerned. There seems to be some evidence that she got rid of an employer of hers by poison. And you know what I think, now? I think that had been sent to Kitely, and he'd plagued her about it, or held it out as a threat to her, and what is it?" The superintendent had risen, and was taking down his overcoat. "Do you know that this woman's leaving the town to morrow?" he said. "And there's her nephew with her, now, been here for a week? Of course, I understand why you've told me all this, Mr. Cotherstone, now that your old affair at Wilchester is common knowledge, far and wide. You don't care, and you don't see any reason for more secrecy?" "My reason," answered Cotherstone, with a grim smile, "is to show Highmarket folk that they aren't so clever as they think. For the probability is that Kitely was killed by that woman, or her nephew, or both." "I'm going up there with a couple of my best men, anyway," said the superintendent. "There's no time to lose if they're clearing out to morrow." "I'll come with you," said Cotherstone. He waited, staring at the fire, until the superintendent had been into the adjacent police station, and had come back to say that he and his men were ready. "What do you mean to do?" he asked, as the four of them set out. "Take them?" "Question them first," answered the superintendent. "I shan't let them get out of my sight, anyway, after what you've told me, for I expect you're right in your conclusions. What is it?" he asked, as one of the two men who followed behind called him. The man pointed down the market place to the doors of the police station. "Two cars just pulled up there, sir," he said. "Came round the corner just now from the Norcaster Road." The superintendent glanced back and saw two staring headlights standing near his own door. "Oh, well, there's Smith there," he said, "and if it's anybody wanting me, he knows where I've gone. Come on. For aught we know these two may have cleared out already." But there were thin cracks of light in the living room window of the lonely cottage on the Shaw, and the superintendent whispered that somebody was certainly there and still up. He halted his companions outside the garden gate, and turned to Cotherstone. "I don't know if it'll be advisable for you to be seen," he said. "I think our best plan'll be for me to knock at the front door and ask for the woman. You other two go round, quietly, to the back door, and take care that nobody gets out that way to the moors at the back. If any one escapes to those moors, they're as good as lost for ever on a dark night. Go round, and when you hear me knock at the front, you knock at the back." The two men slipped away around the corner of the garden and through the adjacent belt of trees, and the superintendent gently lifted the latch of the garden gate. "You keep back, Mr. Cotherstone, when I go to the door," he said. "You never know. Hullo! What's this?" Men were coming up the wood behind them, quietly but quickly. One of them, ahead of the others, carried a bull's eye lamp, and in swinging it around revealed himself as one of the superintendent's own officers. He caught sight of his superior and came forward. "Mr. Brereton's here, sir, and some gentlemen from Norcaster," he said. "They want to see you particularly. Something about this place, so I brought them." It was at that moment that the sound of the two revolver shots rang out in the silence from the stillness of the cottage, and at that the superintendent dashed forward, with a cry to the others, and began to beat on the front door, and while his men responded with similar knockings at the back, he called loudly on Miss Pett to open. It was Mallalieu who at last flung the door open and confronted the amazed and wondering group clustered thickly without. Every man there shrank back affrighted at the desperation on the cornered man's face. But Mallalieu did not shrink, and his hand was strangely steady as he singled out his partner and shot him dead, and just as steady as he stepped back and turned the revolver on himself. A moment later the superintendent snatched the bull's eye lamp from his man, and stepped over Mallalieu's dead body, and went into the cottage, to come back on the instant, shivering and sick with shock at the sight his startled eyes had met. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of The Borough Treasurer by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. Chapter 31 The Barrister's Fee. 6 months later, on a fine evening which came as the fitting close of a perfect May afternoon, Brereton got out of a London express at Norcaster, and entered the little train which made its way by a branch line to the very heart of the hills. He had never been back to these northern regions since the tragedies of which he had been an unwilling witness, and when the little train came to a point in its winding career amongst the fell sides and valleys from whence Highmarket could be seen, with the tree-crowned Shaw above it, he resolutely turned his face and looked in the opposite direction. He had no wish to see the town again. He would have been glad to cut that chapter out of his book of memories. Nevertheless, being so near to it, he could not avoid the recollections which came crowding in on him because of his knowledge that Highmarket's old gables and red roofs were there, within a mile or two, had he cared to look at them in the glint of the westering sun. No, he would never willingly set foot in that town again. There was nobody there now that he had any desire to see. Bent, when the worst was over, and the strange and sordid story had come to its end, had sold his business, quietly married Letty, and taken her away for a long residence abroad, before returning to settle down in London. Brereton had seen them for an hour or two as they passed through London on their way to Paris and Italy, and had been more than ever struck by young Mrs. Bent's philosophical acceptance of facts. Her father, in Letty's opinion, had always been a deeply wronged and much injured man, and it was his fate to have suffered by his lifelong connection with that very wicked person, Mallalieu. He had unfortunately paid the penalty at last, and there was no more to be said about it. It might be well, thought Brereton, that Bent's wife should be so calm and equable of temperament, for Bent, on his return to England, meant to go in for politics, and Letty would doubtless make an ideal helpmeet for a public man. She would face situations with a cool head and a well-balanced judgment. And so, in that respect, all was well. At the same time, Brereton had a strong notion that neither Mr. nor Mrs. Bent would ever revisit Highmarket. As for himself, his thoughts went beyond Highmarket, to the place amongst the hills which he had never seen. After Harborough's due acquittal, Brereton, having discharged his task, had gone back to London. But ever since then he had kept up a regular correspondence with Avis, and he knew all the details of the new life which had opened up for her and her father with the coming of Mr. Raythwaite of Wray. Her letters were so full of vivid descriptions of Wray itself, and of the steward's house in which she and Harborough, now appointed steward and agent to his foster brother's estate, had taken up their residence. She had a gift of description, and Brereton had gained a good notion of Wray from her letters, an ancient and romantic place, set amongst the wild hills of the border, lonely amidst the moors, and commanding wide views of river and sea. It was evidently the sort of place in which a lover of open spaces, such as he knew Avis to be, could live an ideal life. But Brereton had travelled down from London on purpose to ask her to leave it. He had come at last on a sudden impulse, unknown to any one, and therefore unexpected. Leaving his bag at the little station in the valley at which he left the train just as the sun was setting behind the surrounding hills, he walked quickly up a winding road between groves of fir and pine towards the great grey house, which he knew must be the place into which the man from Australia had so recently come under romantic circumstances. At the top of a low hill he paused and looked about him, recognizing the scenes from the descriptions which Avis had given him in her letters. There was Wray itself, a big old-world place, set amongst trees at the top of a long park-like expanse of falling ground; hills at the back; the sea in the far distance. The ruins of an ancient tower stood near the house. Still nearer to Brereton, in an old-fashioned flower-garden, formed by cutting out a plateau on the hillside, stood a smaller house which he knew, also from previous description, to be the steward's. He looked long at this before he went nearer to it, hoping to catch the flutter of a gown amongst the rose-trees already bright with bloom. And at last, passing through the rose-trees, he went to the stone porch and knocked, and was half afraid lest Avis herself should open the door to him. Instead came a strapping, red-cheeked north-country lass, who stared at this evident traveller from far-off parts, before she found her tongue. No, Miss Avis wasn't in; she was down the garden, at the far end. Brereton hastened down the garden, turned a corner; they met unexpectedly. Equally unexpected, too, was the manner of their meeting. for these two had been in love with each other from an early stage of their acquaintance, and it seemed only natural now that when at last they touched hands, hand should stay in hand. And when two young people hold each other's hands, especially on a springtide evening, and under the most romantic circumstances and surroundings, lips are apt to say more than tongues, which is as much as to say that without further preface these two expressed all they had to say in their first kiss. Nevertheless, Brereton found his tongue at last. For when he had taken a long and searching look at the girl, and found in her eyes what he sought, he turned and looked at wood, hill, sky, and sea. "This is all as you described it," he said, with his arm round her. "And yet the first real thing I have to say to you now that I am here is, to ask you to leave it." She smiled at that, and again put her hand in his. "But we shall come back to it now and then, together," she said. The End. End of Chapter 31, and the end of The Borough Treasurer by J.S. Fletcher. Recorded for LibriVox by MaryAnn Spiegel in June 2014. Thank you for listening.